Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever spilt extra thin cement all over your workbench, including the parts you were working on, not that I've done that, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe buttons. Today we're back to the E-60 paper panzer, the saber-toothed tiger. So construction was complete in the previous video. Today I'm going to be doing the painting and chipping. So I'm using Mission Models paints through this process, and we'll roll through this pretty quickly. It's a fairly simple paint scheme that's going to be applied. In fact, so simple this video might be a little too quick. So I think I'll roll out a second video this week with the next step, and that'll get us much closer to getting onto weathering and oil paint rendering, which will see this project come through to a conclusion in the next few weeks. Hope you've been waiting for this one because it's going to be a good one with a lot of detail, even though it's going to be a quick video. So let's get some paint on. Okay, so let's start with the primer coat. So as you can see, I'm using Mission Models Primer 001, their black primer. The reason I'm using a black primer on this particular paint job is I need the top coats to have the black just coming through subtly underneath. It's not about producing a shadow coat, it's more about influencing the top coat, which will be a red oxide. So I want a really dull, dark finish to that oxide. I'm not going to shoot that red oxide with full opacity either, so I want a little bit of the black just peeping through. You'll notice here that with the runoff down the cup, it's probably a little thin, but I do need to use in this weather in Queensland because of our high heat and humidity at the moment. I need a little extra thinner in it to maintain a full opacity with the spray and to try and minimise tip drying as well on the airbrush. An interesting feature with Mission Models primers is that they contain the polyurethane additive. So they'll dry to a semi-gloss finish or satin, depending on how you lay the paint down. Having that polyurethane additive in the paint means that it will not only bond well to the surface of the model that you're painting, it will be somewhat more durable. After the primer, I'll move on to the second coat, which will be a dark rust, followed by red oxide. So the reason for me using the dark rust here is when I chip the red oxide top coat, I'll come down through that into the rust color, which will simulate wear on the vehicle by the crew who would have otherwise blown through the red primer into the surface of the bare metal underneath, and the light rust that will occur over time will be represented by this dark rust color. It's just different enough in color and tone that it'll be recognizable when I chip. So what I do here is turn the pressure down in the airbrush and spray highlight areas that I know are likely to be chipped through that process. So on the turret here you can see how little I've really needed to use, which is great. It saves use of paint, of course, but it provides that color that I need for when I go to chip. And moving on to spraying the red oxide coat. So this is not red oxide primer as such, but it is color-wise the same as a red oxide primer. And I'm using it to replicate a vehicle which has been hurriedly painted out of the factory. In fact, that's what the camouflage pattern on this kit is going to be. This E-60, if it ever had been produced at the end of the war, or the war had moved into 1946, the Germans were already suffering severe shortages of a great deal of parts and supplies that they needed, and that included their paint supplies. So what I'm intending to replicate in this kit is a vehicle that would have been sprayed in red oxide from the factory, probably very hurriedly, and probably a very poor paint job too, to be honest, which is why you can see here I'm spraying in a very rough, semi-translucent fashion, because I want that black primer coat to come through underneath to simulate a really poor paint job at the factory. So while I'm spraying this, I'm actually holding the airbrush a little further away from the model than I normally would, because I don't want a defined complete opacity in the paint. I'm looking for it to be mottled, semi-transparent. As you can see in the finished product, that's exactly what I've done. So next we'll move on to painting the barrel for the main armament. Rheinmetall, the manufacturer of these 128mm massive guns, provided those to the builders of the armoured vehicles in a heat-proof primer. Not an uncommon thing at that time, and what I'm going to do here is replicate the effects of that primer on a used tank. So I've sprayed this initially using the black primer and then oversprayed that using German grey, and as you can see now I'm using the gold grey over that, which is a much lighter shade and would replicate what Rheinmetall would have provided. So Dunkelgelb, or dark yellow, is an interesting colour come towards the latter part of the war. In late 1944, the Germans had moved to RAL 7028, which was a lighter version of their dark yellow Dunkelgelb that they'd used previously. The camouflage pattern I'm going to spray with Dunkelgelb will replicate the Octopus tigers from the Kassel region of Germany right at the end of the war. These were known as Octopus tigers because the camouflage somewhat reflected the tentacles and suckers of an octopus. So this is the section of the video where I get to show you a massive painting error and some of the process I had to go through to correct that. So let's hope that at some point none of you have to face what I've done here, but this is interesting when your equipment breaks down and what can happen. So I started spraying this and realised that the paint was not coming out as it should do, and I realised that the air pressure on the compressor was a little low. So turning that up to compensate, it then immediately started to splatter paint, which is a clear indication of too much air pressure. The interesting thing was I'd only turned it up from around 9 psi to 15, and at 15 psi there should be no splatter occurring at all. So that led me to further investigate what was going on. And at this point here, I've realised something more serious is happening than just a bit of adjustment with the air pressure. It turns out it was the air regulator valve on my compressor, and it has a serious leak, and it's trying to overcompensate. It's pressing way too much air out. The air pressure is far too high. So in an effort to compensate for the overpressure from the air compressor, I attempted to continue on with the paint job effectively using the trigger on the airbrush as a control means. Realistically, if I'd had a MAC valve attached, I probably could have just left the air pressure high on the compressor and adjusted it down prior to the air entering the valve in the airbrush stem. But so be it. There's something for the future. I need to go and purchase myself a MAC valve. So I'm going to hand paint the round, let's call them octopus sucker markings. I'm not sure what else I could reasonably call these. Because I'm trying to replicate a vehicle that's been very hurriedly pushed out of the factory by the factory workers, and they've applied a hand-applied pattern with these sucker markings, my aim here is to hand paint those to give a rough, textured, unique feeling to each one of those. I could use hand cut masks to spray these sucker markings on, but what I would end up with then would be even, very regular shapes across the surface, and that's not really what I'm after here. Pulling out my wet palette and some acrylic paint. I can hand paint those features that are left to do, and then I move on to Mr. Metal Color Brass. So this brass paint is going to be used for the brass fittings on the end of the poles for the barrel cleaning kit. Given how jittery my hand appears to be here, I might have had a little too much coffee on this particular day. Okay, so time to finish off the last of the road wheels and suspension gear. So I'm going to do a very quick demonstration here of how I chip Mission Models paints just using water and a soft bristled brush. So it's entirely dependent on how much water is used in the application here and how much pressure I'm using with the brush. Best results are working in a controlled manner. I take the brush and dip it into a container of water just off screen, and then wick away most of that water using some paper towel, and then I touch that onto the skin of my hand, and I can tell very quickly whether the brush is dry enough to use. So it's really a matter of a combination of scrubbing and burnishing here to get the water that's left on the brush to move through the paint and chip away, much like using a chipping solution. The difference here is that as I'm scrubbing away, I'm also burnishing the paint at the same time. So you'll notice on that inner ring that it's changing colour slightly, as well as getting a few larger chips to come off. And then on that next outer ring, you'll see it's starting to change colour as well. And that's as a result of me scrubbing away and slightly dissolving the paint using water and the scrubbing motion. It's a great controllable process. It enables me to very quickly or slowly, depending on the result I'm looking for. And I'm working actually quite slowly here because what I want is, this would be a relatively new tank, maybe a few months old. I don't want heavy chipping, but I do want wear on the raised parts and the outer edge of that road wheel. So that discoloration is the red oxide underneath starting to come through. If I take my time working around those raised parts, I can get a little more colour, very fine chips. In fact, if I could zoom in just on this point here, you would see tiny little red chips just starting to show through. If I show another wheel which I've worked on, you can get much larger chips if you need to. And moving to the top of the hull, I'm just working away on those obvious areas where the crew would walk along the vehicle and chip away the paint, on edges just over the fenders, around the edge of the turret, over the crew hatches, the periscopes in front of the driver and radio operator, over tool clasps and tool location areas, and just in general places where the crew would climb on and off the vehicle and up over edges. Chipping and weathering is a slow and often tedious process, but these foundation layers set the story for the upcoming weathering and details. It's important that we take the time to prepare the surfaces as best we can in order to aid the setting of a strong foundation. I'll then move on to burnishing. So I treat burnishing and chipping as two separate parts of the same process. So I'll chip away first, and then I'll come in with a completely dry, soft bristled brush and scrub away at the paint in those high traffic areas which I've just mentioned. So working around this crew hatch here, I'm looking at points where a crewman would climb in and out of the hatch, scuff it with their boots, rub their clothing across it as they climb in and out. That produces, particularly on the red oxide, a lot of fine scratches and wear marks, which almost polishes the paint. It'll make it darker, and in some cases, if we push through a little bit with the burnishing, you'll come through to a shinier metal surface underneath. Looking at the detail here, you can see these microchips are in scale. They're very difficult to replicate with other paints. They just don't wear the same as these mission model acrylics. And just looking at this single hatch, it's only 3mm in size. The detail in the chips is astounding. Well, that's it for the painting phase. If you've come this far, thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'd like to sincerely thank you for watching this video as I try to grow this channel and expand the community. This What If Panzer is going to have a very interesting paint scheme. Let me know what you think in the comments, as I really enjoy receiving feedback from other modelers. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm now preparing another video for later this week, so please keep a lookout for that. And if you like what I'm producing, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, as they really do help a lot. So until the next time, build your models and consider supporting your local hobby shop, because those guys are family-owned businesses and really enjoy your support.